Usually, when we talk about testing the limits of something, right, there's this expectation of like clinical precision.
Oh, absolutely. Like an engineering lab.
Exactly. You take a piece of industrial steel, you lock it into one of those massive hydraulic testing machines, you apply tension, and you just watch the digital gauge.
Right, and it bends, it groans a bit.
And eventually it violently snaps. And the engineer points at the readout, writes down a number, and that is its definitive breaking point. It's either intact or it's broken. The boundary is totally visible.
Yeah, and we really crave that kind of binary categorization as humans. I mean, it's deeply comforting to believe that resilience can be mapped out on a neat, predictable curve.
Right.
Especially, when we are trying to comprehend our own limits.
But, and this is where it gets heavy, if you step into the landscape of extreme human trauma, if you subject the human soul to the absolute ultimate stress test, that pristine testing machine just shatters into a million pieces.
Yeah, it completely falls apart.
Because the breaking point of the human spirit isn't a neat metric. It adapts, it contorts, it numbs itself to a staggering degree, and sometimes inexplicably, it transcends.
It's incredible.
So today, you and I are taking a deep dive into what is arguably the darkest existential laboratory in human history. Our mission is to explore one of the most profound, haunting, and ultimately life-affirming psychological documents ever written.
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes. And the stakes of this deep dive, for you listening right now, really cannot be overstated.
No, they can't. I mean, we are looking at the firsthand autobiographical account of a man who was an established, successful psychiatrist in Vienna.
Right.
And suddenly he finds himself stripped of absolutely everything. His life's work, his practice, his identity.
And God, tragically, his pregnant wife, his parents, his brother.
Yeah. His entire family, save for one sister, perished in the Nazi concentration camps. And Frankl took that unimaginable descent into hell and somehow merged with a theoretical framework for a meaning-centered psychotherapy,
which he called logotherapy. It is the ultimate distillation of resilience. We are exploring the actual mechanisms of how an individual reduced to a tattooed number, starving, freezing, expecting extermination by the hour, can still manufacture a reason to live.
And crucial for the listener, how you can take these hard-won insights and apply them to the existential voids or the daily struggles in your own life today.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the triumph at the end of this book, we really have to start at the psychological ground zero of the nightmare.
Yeah, we have to go to the arrival.
The text outlines 3 distinct psychological phases the inmates went through, and it begins with a period defined by one overwhelming emotion, which is just pure shock.
And that psychological conditioning for terror, it began long before they ever stepped off the train. The journey itself was literally engineered to break the mind.
Just the physical reality of it.
Right. Picture 1,500 human beings crammed into a train for days and nights. 80 people in a single train coach.
Unimaginable.
Lying on top of each other, on top of their meager remaining luggage. They are traveling through the gray dawn, entirely disoriented, just peering through these tiny barred windows.
Not even knowing what country they're in anymore.
Exactly. Not knowing if they're still in Silesia or if they've crossed into Poland.
And Frankl describes the train's whistle during this. He says it had this uncanny, piercing sound. He actually likens it to a desperate cry for help from someone plummeting toward their doom.
It sets this horrifying tone.
It really does. Then the train violently shunts. Right. They are nearing a main station, and someone spots a sign. Just a simple piece of painted wood.
But the name on it.
Yeah. The name triggers an immediate, visceral, biological panic. The sign just says, Auschwitz.
And at that time, that name alone was the absolute apex of human terror. It stood for gas chambers, crematoriums, industrial-scale massacres.
Worst things you can imagine.
And the realization slowly dawns on the prisoners as the camp's perimeter comes into view. Long stretches of electrified barbed wire, watchtowers, searchlights.
And the people. He sees these ragged, ghost-like human figures dragging themselves through the desolate mud.
Yeah, his imagination instantly runs wild. Frankl talks about hallucinating gallows with people dangling from them.
But then, and this is so bizarre, the psychological script totally flips in a completely unexpected way. The train doors are flung open, and these prisoners storm in to unload the luggage. They have the striped uniforms and the shaved heads, sure, but
they look well fed.
They do. They look surprisingly healthy. They're speaking multiple European languages, and They're actually cracking jokes.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that we are witnessing the immediate deployment of a highly documented psychiatric defense mechanism.
Which is?
It's known as the delusion of reprieve.
The delusion of reprieve.
Right. It's heavily observed in condemned prisoners moments before execution. They suddenly construct this vivid, intense illusion that they might receive a governor's pardon at the very last second.
Like the brain just says, nope, not processing this.
Exactly. The brain simply refuses to process its own imminent destruction. It grabs onto any false hope.
And Frankl says his own born optimism, which had, helped him navigate so many desperate situations, violently latched onto these well-fed prisoners.
He's rationalizing it.
Yeah, he looks at them and his brain goes, hey, they look okay. They're laughing. Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe I'll get assigned to whatever favorable working party they belong to.
It's an infectious, desperate denial by the whole group.
But they didn't know who those guys actually were.
No. He had no way of knowing that these men were a specially chosen elite. They were the receiving squad. They took charge of the confiscated luggage, the smuggled jewelry, the hidden alcohol.
Right. They were basically the aristocracy of the camp.
Yeah. And the new arrivals, shivering and terrified, are collectively engaging in this delusion, clinging to the appearance of these few men as hard evidence that they're going to survive.
But that delusion is shattered with just ruthless bureaucratic efficiency almost immediately.
Right off the train.
They are herded off, ordered to leave absolutely all their luggage behind, and segregated into two lines. Men on one side, women on the other.
And this initiates the terrifying sorting process the inmates later grimly referred to as the finger game.
The finger game!
The first selection. It remains one of the most chillingly detached depictions of mass murder ever recorded.
Because it wasn't chaotic, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
There's no screaming malice in this specific moment. Frankl describes this tall, slim SS officer in a spotless, perfectly tailored uniform.
Wow.
The officer looks completely relaxed. He adopts an attitude of careless ease. He supports his right elbow with his left hand, and with the forefinger of his right hand, he just lazily points.
Left. Right, left. And the prisoners, they have absolutely no idea what the casual pointing means. Rumors start rippling down the line that right means work, and left is for the sick or incapable who are going to some, quote, special camp.
So Frankl tries to game the system.
He does. He hides his heavy haversack under his coat.
Yeah.
He forces himself to walk perfectly upright and tries to look vigorous and young. And the officer looks him over, hesitates for a fraction of a second, and turns him to the right.
And Frankl genuinely believed he had just successfully navigated a job assignment.
Right.
The horrific reality of that gesture isn't revealed until that evening. What that casual finger pointing to the left actually dictated was immediate execution.
It's just sickening. 90% of the entire transport was sent to the left. The sentence was carried out within hours.
Straight to the gas chambers.
Marched straight to the crematoriums, to the buildings explicitly designed with the word bath written over the doors in several languages just to maintain the deception until the very last second.
Yeah, and there's that terrible moment when Frankl asks a veteran inmate where his friend P went, the colleague who was sent left.
And the veteran inmate just coldly points to a chimney a few hundred yards away, which is sending this thick column of flame into the gray sky. And he tells Frankl, that's where your friend is floating up to heaven.
It's brutally blunt. And for the 10% who survived that initial selection, like Frankl, the systematic dismantling of their human identity commenced right then.
A literal and metaphorical stripping.
Yes. They are marched to the cleansing station, and Frankl attempts this desperate negotiation to hold on to the single most important artifact of his previous life.
His scientific manuscript.
His life's work.
Exactly. It's rolled up and hidden in the inner pocket of his coat. He tries to take an older veteran prisoner into his confidence. He points to the hidden paper, frantically explaining that it is his magnum opus.
That it contains his defining theories, that he has to keep it at all costs.
And the veteran prisoner just stares at him, and his expression cycles rapidly from pity to amusement to outright mockery, and he shouts one word, shit.
Yeah.
That is the precise moment the complete erasure of Frankl's former life crystallizes. He realizes the absolute totality of his loss.
The world he belonged to an hour ago simply does not exist anymore. It's gone.
They are given exactly 2 minutes to get fully undressed. They're ordered to drop everything except their shoes and maybe a belt. Then the leather whips start crashing down on their naked bodies.
They are herded into a room where every single hair on their body is aggressively shaved off.
Not just their heads, right?
No, their faces, their chests, their legs, everything. They are systematically reduced to what Frankl terms naked existence.
Naked existence.
Every document proving they were a citizen, a doctor, a husband, gone. Their names are replaced. They are soon to be tattooed with a number.
And that number becomes their entire existence.
Literally. If a guard wants to file a charge against a prisoner, he doesn't ask his name. He just glances at the number tattooed on his skin or sewn on his rags.
But the psychological reaction that emerges from this nakedness is truly bizarre. Because, you'd expect utter meltdown, screaming, panic.
Sure, that would be the normal reaction.
But Frankl describes two very distinct, almost clinical sensations emerging. The first is a grim, surreal sense of humor.
Which sounds crazy, but it makes sense under the circumstances.
Right. They are standing there, completely naked, shivering violently in the cold, stripped of everything that made them human. And when the shower actually turns on, they realize with immense relief that it's real water coming out of the sprays.
Not Cyclone B gas.
Exactly. And they actually start making fun of themselves. They realize they literally have nothing left to lose except their ridiculously naked bodies.
And the second sensation is an intense, cold curiosity.
Yeah, talk about that because that's fascinating.
Well, Frankl compares it to a moment he experienced in a mountain climbing accident years before. In the critical split second of falling, facing potential death, he didn't feel terror.
He felt detached.
Highly detached. He was curious about whether he'd survive with a fractured skull or what the specific injuries would be.
Just observing himself.
Exactly. Now, standing outside naked in the freezing late autumn wind, still wet from the showers, they are looking at their own trembling bodies with cold curiosity, wondering, are we going to catch a cold?
I want to really dig into this specific psychological defense mechanism because it reminds me heavily of how a heavy-duty electrical circuit breaker works in a house.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. When a house gets hit with a massive catastrophic surge of electricity, like a lightning strike, the breaker instantly trips. It severs the connection.
Because if it doesn't
physically sever that connection, the overwhelming voltage will melt the wiring, catch the walls on fire, and burn the entire structure to the ground.
Right.
So is this cold curiosity the mind's way of violently severing the emotional connection to prevent the brain from literally dying of shock?
That is exactly the mechanism.
Yeah.
The psychiatric term for it is ego splitting. The mind dissociates the observing self from the experiencing self.
It just cuts the cord.
Yeah. Frankl quotes the philosopher Lessing, who noted that there are things which must cause you to lose your reason or you have none to lose. In clinical psychiatry, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is actually normal behavior. If you acted, quote, normally in a concentration camp, with standard levels of grief, outrage, and panic at seeing people murdered, your nervous system would overload.
You burn the house down.
You would be psychologically and physically destroyed within hours.
And physical destruction was a constant temptation. Almost everyone entertained the thought of suicide in those first few desperate days.
The colloquial phrase in the camp was running into the wire, grabbing the highly electrified barbed wire fence.
But Frankl made a firm, solemn promise to himself on his very first night that he would not do it.
He did, though the sheer hopelessness of the situation was absolute. But, that initial phase of shock and detached curiosity cannot be sustained indefinitely.
Right. The circuit breaker can't stay tripped forever, or the house just remains dark and freezing.
Exactly. It's a temporary buffer. As the days bleed into weeks and the relentless, grinding reality of camp life sets in, the mind cannot remain in a state of hypervigilant shock. It has to build a permanent, heavy armor.
The system has to reboot in a completely altered state. The mind effectively dies to the outside world. And that is when true apathy sets in, ushering in the second phase of the prisoner's psychology.
The transition into apathy is essentially an emotional death. It is the systematic blunting of all normal human reactions.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this emotional death, because the examples Frankl provides are deeply, deeply disturbing.
They are.
Initially, the longing for home and family is so acute it consumes them, but then an overwhelming disgust takes over. Disgust at the filth, the mud, the excrement.
Because new arrivals were often forced to clean the latrines.
Right. And if sewage splashed in their faces and they showed normal disgust or tried to wipe it off, a prisoner acting as a guard would brutalize them.
The natural biological reaction of disgust is violently beaten out of them.
And following the death of disgust comes the death of empathy. During the first few days, a new prisoner looks away when someone is being beaten. They physically cannot bear to witness the cruelty.
Weeks later,
their feelings are completely blunted. They watch, unmoved. He describes a moment sitting in the sickbay. He watches completely emotionless as a 12-year-old boy who had been forced to stand in the freezing snow barefoot for hours is treated by the camp doctor.
It's a horrifying scene.
The doctor is using tweezers to literally pick off the boy's black, gangrenous, frostbitten toes one by one, and Frankl feels absolutely nothing. No horror, no pity.
He shares another instance where he is casually sipping his watery soup. He looks out the small window of his hut, and staring right back at him are the glazed eyes of a corpse.
Just staring at him.
A man he had been speaking to just 2 hours prior had succumbed to typhus, was dragged outside by his ankles with his head thumping on the stairs, and dumped in the mud.
And Frankl stares directly into the dead man's eyes and simply takes another sip of his soup.
He notes that from a professional psychiatric standpoint, if his lack of emotion hadn't objectively surprised him in retrospect, he wouldn't even remember the incident. That's how routine it was.
But here is where the psychological analysis deepens. The physical suffering is unimaginable. Constant starvation, freezing temperatures, disease. But Frankl insists that the mental agony of an unjust insult often inflicted far more damage than the physical blows.
Because the insult is a direct assault on the core self. It's an attack on human dignity itself.
Right.
Frankl gives an incredible example of this distinction. He's working on a railway track in a blinding snowstorm. He is exhausted, freezing, starving. For just a fraction of a moment, he pauses to catch his breath and leans on his shovel.
And a guard spots him.
The guard spots him, but the guard doesn't hit him. He doesn't even swear at him.
The guard just playfully picks up a stone from the track and tosses it at him.
Yeah. And Frankl observes that to him, that tossed stone felt like the way you attract the attention of a beast, a domestic animal you're calling back to its labor.
A creature with which you have so little in common that you don't even bother to punish it with human language.
Exactly. It was the complete reduction of his humanity to that of a disposable beast of burden that caused the true agony. He said it hurt far more than a whip strike, which would at least acknowledge him as an enemy to be punished.
That makes total sense. He tells another story about a foreman, a man with chubby, rosy cheeks and thick, warm gloves, who starts screaming at Frankl. He tells him he'll die like an animal, calls him a swine, asks if he was a soft businessman who never get a stroke of real work in his life.
And Frankl snaps back.
He does. Momentarily past caring about the physical danger, he straightens up, looks him dead in the eye, and says he was a doctor, a specialist, who worked in clinics for the poor for free.
And the foreman goes completely mad and violently attacks him, naturally.
Right. But Frankl notes that his indignation at that moment wasn't fear of the impending pain. It was the profound insult of having his life and his worth judged by a man who looked so vulgar and brutal that the triage nurse in Frankl's old hospital wouldn't have even let him sit in the waiting room.
It was a flash of inner pride. But those flashes were rare because mostly the psychology was characterized by a severe regression.
Right, regression to primitive states.
The constant looming threat of death, combined with severe caloric restriction, forces the inner life down to a highly primitive level. Psychoanalysts in the camp actively discuss this regression. All higher thoughts, all complex intellectual pursuits just vanish.
The brain chemistry literally alters under starvation.
It does. The mind becomes obsessively fixated on the most primitive biological needs. What do starving men dream about? Not abstract philosophy or high art.
No.
They dream exclusively about bread, cake, warm baths, and cigarettes.
And their waking hours are entirely consumed by the terrifying economics of survival. The whole camp operated on a caloric deficit mathematically designed to work the prisoners to death. Let's delve into the currency of the camp because it highlights just how razor-thin the margin of survival was.
Well, the microeconomy of the camp was fundamentally built on soup and cigarettes.
Yeah.
And to understand the gravity of this currency, you really have to understand the ultimate terror of the camp, becoming a Muslim.
A Muslim. That was the grim camp slang for a man who looks absolutely miserable, sick, and completely emaciated.
A man whose body has literally begun consuming its own muscle tissue and who can no longer perform hard physical labor.
And every single Muslim goes to the gas chambers.
It was an absolute, inescapable certainty. The selection process was constant. Therefore, the singular goal upon waking every single day was to look fit for work.
Yeah, an older, seasoned prisoner gives Frankl vital advice on his very first day. He says, shave daily, even if you have to use a piece of broken glass to do it. Even if you have to trade your last piece of bread for that piece of glass.
Because you will look younger, and the aggressive scraping will make your cheeks look temporarily ruddier.
Right. If you limp because of a blister, the SS man will spot it and wave you to the left. The margin for error was literally zero.
It's terrifying. Frankl talks about receiving a premium coupon for digging a tunnel for a water main. The coupon cost the construction firm 50 pfennigs, but in the camp economy, it could be exchanged for 6 cigarettes.
And he carefully saved up 2 tokens worth 12 cigarettes, but he didn't smoke them.
No, because in that brutal economy, a cigarette was the ultimate luxury of the doomed. The privilege of smoking was exclusively reserved for the papos, the privileged prisoners who had guaranteed rations.
For a normal, starving prisoner, those 12 cigarettes could be traded for 12 bowls of watery soup.
And that exchange buys a temporary, literal respite from starving to death. It buys you a few more days of life.
He points out a chilling metric, actually. If you saw a regular comrade smoking his own cigarettes, you instantly knew he had given up.
He had lost the will to live.
Exactly. He just wanted to enjoy his last remaining days in a haze of nicotine. And once that fundamental will to live was lost, the body rapidly shut down. It seldom returned.
This primitive edge-of-death existence totally distorts the perception of suffering. And Frankl proposes a brilliant analogy to explain this: the relativity of suffering.
Oh, the gas analogy.
Right. He compares human suffering to the physical behavior of a gas. If you pump a specific quantity of gas into an empty chamber, it will expand perfectly to fill the chamber completely and evenly, regardless of how massive the room is.
So suffering completely fills the human soul and the conscious mind, no matter whether the objective cause of the suffering is massive or minor.
Precisely. It takes up all the available psychological bandwidth.
And because the suffering is total, the smallest, most insignificant mercies bring a joy that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. The negative happiness, as the philosopher Schopenhauer called it, just the sudden, brief freedom from suffering.
He illustrates this beautifully with their transfer from Auschwitz to a smaller camp affiliated with Dachau. They arrive after traveling for 2 days and 3 nights, crammed into a train car, mostly standing, soaked in human urine. But the older prisoners relay the news. This specific camp has no crematorium, no gas chamber.
And the prisoners literally jump for joy.
They do.
They are forced to stand outside in the freezing rain all night long because a man fell asleep and the roll call was short, so they are punished by standing in the storm. And yet they are thrilled because there is no chimney.
Or the immense joy of finding out you get to be admitted to the sick bay for 2 days where you don't have to march out into the snow.
Yeah.
Just lying on hard wooden boards suffering from typhus is pure bliss compared to the agonizing work details.
I want to clarify something for the listener about this apathy we keep mentioning, because today, when we use the word apathy, we picture like a teenager shrugging their shoulders, disconnected, giving up on a task.
It implies a passive surrender.
Exactly. So didn't these prisoners just surrender? Doesn't apathy just mean they gave up?
That is a vital distinction. We must not confuse clinical protective apathy with surrender. For the concentration camp prisoner, apathy was not a passive state. It was a highly active militant mechanism of self-defense. By forcefully blunting their emotional responses to the daily horrors around them, they conserved their incredibly limited mental and physical energy. The external reality was deliberately dimmed so that all remaining effort could be laser-focused on one single critical task, preserving their own biological life and the lives of their immediate friends.
So apathy was a heavy shield, not a white flag.
Exactly.
That makes perfect sense. The apathy shields them from the external horror. But, human consciousness abhors a vacuum. If the outside world is completely shut off, if the emotional receptors are deadened to the violence and the cold, awareness has to pool somewhere.
It pulls inward.
Right. And this leads us to one of the most astonishing observations in the entire text: the profound deepening of the spiritual and inner life.
This internal retreat presents a massive paradox regarding survival in the camps, because one would logically assume that the big, burly, physically robust individuals would have the highest survival rate.
Yeah, it was a supreme physical endurance test.
But Frankl observed the exact opposite. Often, highly sensitive people who were accustomed to a rich intellectual and spiritual life prior to the camps actually survived better than those robust individuals.
Physically, they might have been of delicate constitution, but the damage inflicted on their inner selves was significantly less.
They survived because they had a sanctuary. When the external world became an unendurable hell of mud, blood, and starvation, they could retreat into what Frankl called inner riches and spiritual freedom.
he paints this incredibly vivid, heartbreaking picture. They're marching out to the work site in the freezing, pitch-black dawn. They're stumbling over big stones through icy puddles, guards constantly shouting and hitting them with the butts of their rifles.
And the man marching next to him whispers.
He whispers, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us."
And that single, brief comment sends Frankl's mind retreating rapidly inward. He begins thinking of his wife. He reconstructs her image with uncanny, hyper-realistic acuteness.
He literally hears her answering him. He sees her smile, her frank and encouraging look. He writes that her look was more luminous than the sun beginning to rise over the horizon.
And in that freezing march, he has this profound realization. He says for the very first time in his life, he saw the absolute truth set into song by so many poets and proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire.
The salvation of man is through love and in love.
This isn't just romantic poetry. It is a profound survival mechanism. He doesn't even know if his wife is still alive. There is no mail, no communication.
But he realizes it fundamentally doesn't matter. Love goes far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in their spiritual being, their inner self.
He writes that even if he knew for a fact she was dead, he would still converse with her image in his mind, and the psychological sustenance would be just as satisfying.
It's an incredible testament to the human mind. And this inner retreat wasn't exclusively about love. It extended to an appreciation of art and nature that became almost hypersensitive, dialed up to an extreme degree.
When the inner life becomes that intensely focused, the contrast with the desolate gray surroundings creates a profound, almost shattering experience of beauty.
He describes a moment where the prisoners are being transported by train and they all crowd around the barred windows, marveling at the mountains of Salzburg glowing with the fire of the sunset.
Right, he notes that if a normal outside citizen saw their faces staring out those barred windows, they would never believe these were men who had supposedly given up all hope of life and liberty.
They were completely enraptured by the sunset. Or the time a prisoner excitedly runs into the hut while they are dead tired, freezing and eating their daily soup, just to tell them to come outside immediately and look at the sky.
And they shuffle out and see these sinister clouds glowing blood, red and steel blue, sharply contrasting with the gray mud of the camp.
And one prisoner, standing in the mud of Auschwitz, looks up and says, "How beautiful the world could be."
He also documents the ghost-like contrast of art in the camp. Occasionally, the prisoners would covertly put together a makeshift cabaret in a cleared hut. Just a few songs and jokes to help them forget, just for half an hour.
But the most striking moment for Frankl is waking up exhausted in his second night at Auschwitz and hearing someone playing a violin in a nearby hut.
It was a desperately sad, haunting tango. The violin literally wept, and Frankl wept with it because he suddenly remembered it was his wife's 24th birthday.
And she was somewhere in that massive camp, completely out of reach. I was trying to conceptualize how this internal vividness works, and it heavily reminds me of a sensory deprivation tank.
Oh, that's an interesting parallel.
Have you ever been in one? You float in highly concentrated salt water, in total darkness and absolute silence. The outside world is completely stripped away. And because your brain has zero external sensory input to process, your internal world turns on the projector with blinding, high-definition clarity.
Memories, visual imagery.
They become incredibly loud and vivid. It feels like Frankl and the other prisoners were forced into a torturous, non-consensual sensory deprivation tank. The outside world was so intolerable, so barren of positive human input, that their internal projector just turned up to maximum brightness to keep them sane.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your analogy highlights a critical mechanism of Frankl's philosophy. Because this retreat into the inner life wasn't mere escapism. It wasn't just a psychological trick to ignore the pain. It was an active, conscious realization of values.
Wait, explain that distinction. How is it an active realization?
Frankl leans heavily on a quote from the novelist Dostoevsky. "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings."
Wow.
Frankl argues that even when a human being is starved, beaten, and thrown into the absolute worst conditions imaginable, they retain one ultimate, unalienable freedom to choose their attitude in any given set of circumstances.
They cannot choose what happens to them. The guards, the starvation, the cold that is fixed, but they retain sovereignty over how they react.
Exactly. By choosing to retreat inward, by actively holding on to love, by choosing to appreciate a sunset, by sharing a last piece of bread with a sicker comrade, they were making a defiant choice not to become just an animal in a herd.
They maintained their inner dignity.
And by doing so, they elevated their suffering into a genuine human achievement. They proved that spiritual freedom cannot be forcibly extracted.
And this wasn't just some lofty academic philosophical exercise. Maintaining this inner hold, this spiritual defiance, was literally a matter of biological life and death. If a prisoner lost that inner hold on their values, their physical body usually surrendered shortly after.
Which forces us to look at the darkest physiological dynamic in the text, the fatal consequences of losing hope.
Right.
This is where Frankl's clinical observations bridge the gap between psychiatry and physiology. The mind-body connection in survival is laid completely bare in the camp environment.
He recounts a deeply disturbing story about a friend, the senior block warden, who was a well-known composer. This friend pulls Frankl aside in February 1945 and confides in him. He says, "I had a very strange dream. A voice told me I could ask any question. So I asked when the war would be over for me, when our specific camp would be liberated."
And the voice in the dream provided him with a highly specific date, March 30th.
And the friend is absolutely full of hope. He fully believes this prophecy. But as March draws to a close, the war news secretly filtering into the camp is terrible. It becomes painfully obvious that the front lines are moving too slowly. They won't be liberated by the 30th.
So on March 29th, the friend suddenly falls violently ill with a high fever.
On March 30th, the exact day of his prophecy, he becomes delirious and completely loses consciousness. And on March 31st, he dies. The official camp record listed the cause as typhus.
But the ultimate cause, as Frankl medically diagnoses it, was severely dashed hope.
Just giving up.
The sudden, crushing disappointment critically lowered his body's immune resistance against the latent typhus infection that was already endemic in the camp. His faith in the future and his psychological will to live were paralyzed. And without that neurological defense, his physical body immediately succumbed to the bacteria.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. The chief camp doctor shared a staggering statistic with Frankl. He observed a massive, unprecedented spike in the death rate between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945.
And the doctor explicitly noted that this massive die-off wasn't due to harsher winter weather or a further reduction in rations or a new epidemic outbreak.
It was purely psychological.
Yes. The majority of the prisoners had collectively clung to the naive, desperate hope that they would be home by Christmas. When the holidays arrived and the brutal reality set in that they were still trapped in hell, they lost their courage.
Crushing disappointment overcame them. Their physiological resistance plummeted, and they died in droves.
It perfectly illustrates the psychological concept Frankl defines as a provisional existence of unknown limit.
Provisional existence of unknown limit. To grasp this concept, imagine being in a standard civilian prison. A judge gives you a sentence. 5 years. You go to your cell, you mark the days on the wall. You know exactly when it ends, which means you can aim your mind toward a future goal. You can plan what you'll do on day 1 of your release.
But the concentration camp inmates had absolutely no end date. It was an unlimited sentence of torture.
Right.
And Frankl points out that without a future goal, time itself physically deforms. He noted that a single day of torture, standing in the freezing mud, felt like it lasted a week. But an entire week passed in an absolute blur.
Because you can't live for the future, so the present becomes this unreal, ghostly, detached existence. And if you allow the present to become unreal, you stop taking your own life seriously. You just let yourself decline into a Muslim.
To combat this lethal deformation of time, Frankl realized they needed a fundamental, radical shift in perspective. And this realization is the bedrock thesis of his entire life's work.
And what is that?
He writes that we must fundamentally stop asking what we expect from life and realize that life is expecting something from us.
See, I want to debate this for a second, because it is very easy to read that line in a comfortable armchair with a cup of coffee and nod along. But how do you forcefully convey that to someone in the absolute depths of human despair? How do you look at a starting man who is freezing in the mud, whose family has been murdered, and give him a why, saying, "Hey, buddy, life expects something from you"? Sounds almost insulting in that context.
Oh, it'd be insulting if it were delivered as a hollow platitude. But Frankl had to apply this philosophy in real time, under extreme duress, to save lives.
Right.
There's an incredibly tense scene where the inmates of his entire hut are fasting for a full day. They are doing this to protect a comrade who stole a few potatoes. They gave him up, he would be hanged. So they're lying in their bunks in the pitch black, the power's out, they're starving, freezing, and morale has hit rock bottom.
Men are openly talking about suicide.
Exactly. And the block warden begs Frankl to speak to them, to offer some kind of psychological comfort.
Frankl admits he didn't want to do it. He was cold, deeply hungry, and exhausted. But he forces himself to stand up in the dark.
And he doesn't offer them toxic positivity. He doesn't promise them they will survive. He offers them responsibility.
Responsibility.
Yes. He forces them to recognize the uniqueness of their individual destinies. He speaks directly into the darkness, reminding one specific man that he has a child waiting for him in a foreign country, a child who desperately needs his father.
And he reminds another man, a scientist, that he has a series of unfinished manuscripts that literally no one else in the world possesses the specific knowledge to write.
He makes them realize they are entirely irreplaceable.
That is the crucial mechanism. When you realize that you absolutely cannot be replaced, whether it's by a person who deeply loves you or a specific piece of work only you can complete, the responsibility you bear for your own existence appears in all its magnitude.
A man who becomes conscious of this profound responsibility will not throw his life away. He knows the why for his existence, and as Frankl quotes Nietzsche, he who has a why to live can bear with almost anyhow.
He replaces hollow hope with radical duty. It's not about achieving happiness in that moment. It's about fulfilling an obligation to the future.
And eventually, for some of them, that impossible future did arrive, the day of liberation.
But as we transition into the psychology of the freed prisoner, the third and final phase, we see that walking out of those gates was not the cinematic fairy tale ending we instinctively want it to be.
It was, in many profound ways, the beginning of a completely new, highly complex psychological battle.
Let's set the scene. The white flag is finally flying over the camp. The guards, now suddenly terrified and wearing civilian clothes, are bizarrely offering the prisoners cigarettes. The gates are open, the prisoners walk out of the camp, but they don't feel joy.
They feel nothing.
Frankl describes walking out into the meadows, seeing the bright flowers, the blue sky, but feeling absolutely nothing.
The clinical psychiatric term for this is depersonalization. To understand it, imagine sitting in a pitch-black movie theater for hours and then suddenly walking out into the blinding midday sun.
It's totally disorienting.
The real world momentarily feels entirely fake, flat, and alien. Now multiply that disorientation by years of relentless, brutal trauma. After years of horror, everything feels unreal, unlikely, like a dream.
They had dreamt of freedom so many times, only to be violently woken up by the shrill whistle of the guards. Their brains literally could not accept that it was real.
The mind remains completely frozen, but the body just goes wild.
Yeah, the initial unwinding is entirely biological. He describes men eating ravenously for hours, eating half the night until their stomachs protruded. And then the talking. People who were invited into the homes of local farmers would eat, drink coffee, and then talk incessantly.
The pressure valve releases, and the words just violently pour out of them.
But that sudden, violent release of psychological pressure is incredibly dangerous.
Frankl uses the medical analogy of a deep-sea diver. If a diver ascends from the crushing high pressure of the ocean depths too quickly, the nitrogen bubbles in their blood expand and they get the bends, it can be fatal.
Right.
Similarly, a person suddenly released from enormous mental pressure can suffer severe moral damage.
The psychological bends. He gives a startling, sobering example of this moral deformity. He's walking with a friend, another recently liberated prisoner, across a field of green crops.
And Frankl instinctively tries to step around the young crops to avoid damaging them.
But his friend aggressively grabs his arm and drags him right through the middle, deliberately trampling them. When Frankl protests, the friend gets violently angry and shouts, "Hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats."
It's a profound moral inversion. Because they had been the oppressed for so long and suffered so deeply and unjustly, some primitive natures felt that they now possessed a blank check to become the oppressors.
They justified ruthless behavior by pointing to their own victimhood.
Frankl had to gently, but firmly, guide them back to the commonplace truth that absolutely no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been repeatedly done to them.
And if that internal moral struggle wasn't hard enough, there were two other massive external hurdles waiting for them as they reintegrated into the quote-unquote normal world: bitterness and disillusionment.
Bitterness stemmed from the superficial, often callous reactions of the people in their former hometowns. They would return, hoping for deep understanding or empathy, and former neighbors would just shrug and offer platitudes like, "We didn't know," or even worse, "Well, we suffered too with the rationing."
Imagine surviving the gas chambers of Auschwitz, surviving the freezing mud and typhus, and having someone say, "Well, the bread rationing here was pretty tough too." Frankl asks, have they really nothing better to say to me?
It's infuriating.
But disillusionment was a far more crushing blow, because bitterness was about the failure of other people, but disillusionment was about the failure of fate itself.
Yes. Woe to the man who survived the horrors of the camp solely because he was clinging to the desperate memory of a loved one, only to return home and find out that person is dead.
To take the trolley to your old street, walk up to your house, ring the bell, and realize with crushing finality that the person who kept you alive in your dreams for years will never open that door.
He writes that they weren't hoping for happiness in the camps. It wasn't the promise of happiness that gave them courage, but they were absolutely not prepared for this profound unhappiness.
So this raises a massive question. If surviving the absolute worst horror imaginable doesn't even guarantee a happy ending on the other side, what is the goal? What is the psychological goal?
The goal, as Frankl outlines it, isn't a cinematic happy ending where everything is neatly resolved. The crowning experience for the homecoming prisoner is the profound, hard-won realization that after everything they have endured, after all they have suffered and lost, there is absolutely nothing left in the world they need to fear.
They have touched the absolute bottom of human existence, and they survive.
They are fundamentally unbreakable.
And this incredible blood-stained understanding of suffering and resilience leads us directly into the second major part of our deep dive. Because Frankl didn't just write a historical memoir. He took this extreme existential laboratory and turned it into a highly practical, clinical, psychological framework for the rest of the world.
Logotherapy.
Logotherapy. The word logos is a Greek word which denotes meaning. It is a meaning-centered psychotherapy. And to truly understand its revolutionary nature, you have to place it in direct contrast to the dominant psychological theories of Frankl's era.
At the time, you have Sigmund Freud, who argued that the primary human drive is the will to pleasure. Under the Freudian model, we are essentially biological machines driven by instinctual desires and the pursuit of immediate gratification.
And then you have Alfred Adler, who argued for the will to power. The underlying drive is the striving for superiority and dominance.
But Frankl, having observed men literally give away their last piece of life-saving bread to comfort a dying comrade in a starvation camp, realized that neither pleasure nor power is the ultimate driver of human behavior.
The primary motivational force in a human being is the will to meaning. We are fundamentally driven to find a purpose, a why, in our lives.
And when that innate will to meaning is frustrated, when we can't find our purpose, we end up in a state he calls the existential vacuum.
This is perhaps his most relevant and prescient diagnosis for the modern world. The existential vacuum is a widespread cultural phenomenon characterized by a profound feeling of total meaninglessness and inner emptiness.
And it manifests most commonly as a chronic, pervasive state of boredom.
He talks specifically about Sunday neurosis, and I guarantee everyone listening has felt this.
Oh, without a doubt.
It's that creeping depression or anxiety that hits you late on a Sunday afternoon. The rush of the busy work week is over, the external distractions have faded, and the absolute void within yourself becomes totally manifest. You're just sitting on the couch, endlessly scrolling on your phone, feeling completely hollow.
Frankl argues that this existential vacuum is the root cause of so many modern societal crises: mass depression, rampant aggression, and addiction. Because people don't know what their unique purpose is, they attempt to desperately fill the void with pleasure or money or power or drugs.
But those are just proxy targets. They are painkillers, not cures. They never actually fill the vacuum.
So how do we actually cure it? A lot of modern self-care culture tells us we just need to relax. We need to eliminate all stress, find our center, achieve perfect work-life balance. We strive for homeostasis, a completely tensionless state.
Frankl fundamentally and aggressively disagreed with that approach. He considered it a highly dangerous misconception of mental hygiene to believe that what man needs most is a tensionless state.
What we actually require for psychological health is new dynamics, the existential dynamics in a polar field of tension.
Let me try to explain new dynamics using a modern fitness analogy because the concept is brilliant.
Go for it.
When you go to the gym to build muscle, you don't achieve growth by resting on the mat. You achieve muscular hypertrophy by putting the muscle under heavy tension. You have to lift the weight, struggle against the gravity, and that tension forces the muscle fibers to adapt and grow stronger.
That's spot on.
Frankl is saying, The human mind works the exact same way. Mental health requires a healthy, heavy tension between what you have already achieved and what you still ought to accomplish. It's the psychological gap between who you are right now and who you have the potential to become.
That is an excellent analogy. He uses a structural engineering example to make the same point. If architects want to strengthen a decrepit arch, they don't carefully take weight off it. They increase the load laid upon it because that downward pressure forces the individual stones to join more firmly together. You need a load to bear to hold your psychological structure together.
So we need a load. We need a task. And logotherapy lays out 3 highly specific avenues to find that meaning, to find that load.
The first avenue is by creating a work or doing a deed. This is the path of active achievement. Writing a book, building a company, raising a family, inventing a tool, volunteering in your community.
You are bringing something into existence, contributing something to the world that simply would not exist without your specific intervention. It restructures your self-worth because you are actively shaping reality.
The second way to find meaning is by experiencing something or encountering someone.
Experiencing goodness, truth, or beauty. Deeply appreciating nature or culture, but most importantly, experiencing another human being in their very uniqueness by loving them.
And in logotherapy, love isn't just a biological byproduct of the sexual drive. Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of their personality. When you truly love someone, you don't just see who they are, you see their potential.
You see what they can become, and your love helps them actualize that potential.
Exactly. The first 2 avenues make intuitive sense. Do a good deed, create something, fall in love, look at great art. But the third avenue is where Frankl's specific concentration camp experience comes roaring back to the forefront.
The third way to find meaning is by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
When we are backed into a corner and no longer able to change a situation, think of an inoperable terminal disease, the sudden loss of a loved one, a situation where the facts cannot be altered. We are challenged to change ourselves.
Frankl tells a profound story about an elderly general practitioner who came to his clinic severely depressed. His wife had died 2 years prior, he had loved her above all else, and he simply couldn't get over the grief.
And Frankl, remarkably, doesn't prescribe him antidepressants or give him a generic platitude. He just asks him a single paradigm-shifting question.
He asks him, "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?"
The doctor immediately responds, "Oh, for her, this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered."
And Frankl calmly replies, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering, to be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her."
In that singular moment, the man's suffering ceased to be mere meaningless agony because it found a meaning, the meaning of a profound sacrifice. He was enduring the grief so she wouldn't have to.
The doctor shook Frankl's hand and calmly left the office. Frankl couldn't change the man's fate. He couldn't bring the wife back from the dead, but he completely and instantly changed the man's attitude toward his unalterable fate.
It's so powerful.
I have to pause here, though, and raise a crucial point of clarification, just to ensure no one radically misunderstands this philosophy. Does this mean we have to suffer to find meaning? Because honestly, interpreting it that way sounds incredibly masochistic.
Frankl is incredibly explicit in warning against that interpretation. Absolutely not. Right. Suffering is not necessary to find meaning. If your suffering is avoidable, the only meaningful thing to do is to remove the cause of the suffering. If you have a psychological issue, seek therapy. If you have a biological illness, get medical treatment. If you are facing political oppression, fight it. Enduring unnecessary suffering when you have the power to stop it is not heroic. It is purely masochistic.
That is a vital distinction. You don't seek out pain to prove how tough you are.
Exactly. The concept is termed tragic optimism. It simply dictates that meaning is available even if suffering is totally unavoidable. Human beings possess the incredible capacity to turn a personal tragedy into a human triumph, to derive from guilt the opportunity to change for the better.
Understanding that meaning is this active, chosen thing, we are led to what Frankl calls the categorical imperative of logotherapy. It is the ultimate proactive role that you, the listener, can apply to your life right now, and it is a heavy, challenging framework.
Frankl writes, "Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now."
I really want the listener to let that sink in. Imagine your present moment is actually the past. Imagine you already made the mistake of wasting this day, of ignoring your loved ones, of giving into that Sunday neurosis and the existential vacuum, and you've suddenly been granted a magical second chance to go back and fix it.
How would you act right now, knowing the consequences of failure? It completely confronts you with the absolute finality of your life.
It demands responsibleness. Because ultimately, a human being should not ask what the meaning of his life is. He must recognize that he is the one being asked. You are constantly being questioned by life. And you can only respond by being responsible for your actions.
So we challenge you. View your current struggles, your career anxieties, or even just your Sunday afternoon boredom through this lens. What is life asking of you today? Who or what is waiting for you to actualize your potential? What load are you meant to bear?
And as a final thought to mull over, I want to leave you with Frankl's incredibly beautiful concept of transitoriness. We so often fear aging. We fear the passing of time, seeing only what Frankl calls the stubble fields of missed opportunities and fading youth. But he argues that the past is actually a safe granary.
The granary, that is such a powerful image.
Once you've lived an experience, once you have done a good deed or loved someone deeply or suffered bravely, you have rescued it into the past. It is irrevocably stored in the granary. Nothing can ever undo it. Young people might have possibilities in the future, but older people have realities in the past. Having been, Frankl insists, is the surest kind of being.
Having been is the surest kind of being.
So as you look out at the landscape of your own life, remember that the testing machine of the human spirit isn't made of steel, it's made of meaning. And no matter how murky the waters get, no matter how much the pressure builds, that meaning is yours to define. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly profound exploration of the human spirit. Until next time.